Hey guys, tonight we slide quietly into one of the most ridiculous, gold-plated, overly perfumed routines in history, the kind that could only come from the mind of a man who called himself the Sun King. Picture this, a bed with tassels made of silver thread, 20-foot velvet drapes, and oh yes, about 100 people standing around while one man wakes up. That's right, we're in Versailles, and tonight, you're going to drift off inside the absurdly over-orchestrated morning routine of King Louis XIV, where getting out of bed required a crowd, a hierarchy, and a stomach for awkward eye contact before coffee. Now, you probably won't survive this story, at least not without raising one skeptical eyebrow, because there's a very real chance that by the end of it, you'll start wondering why your alarm clock doesn't involve a duke announcing your sock selection. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The curtains are still drawn tight across the eastern windows of Versailles. The scent of beeswax polish, lavender sachets, and lingering eau de cologne wafts through the long halls like a noble ghost. Somewhere down a corridor, a page has already lit the first candle, then another, then another. The king must rise. And you're standing in the royal bedchamber. Don't worry, you're not alone. There are dozens of others here. Nobles, dukes, bishops, royal physicians, feather-wigged attendants, all packed into the space like very fancy sardines, waiting in solemn silence for a man to sit up and scratch his head. Mainstream fact. Louis XIV's daily lever. His ceremonial awakening was a staged event in which carefully ranked guests were permitted to enter his bedchamber in phases. First, the highest nobles, then mid-tier courtiers, then lucky low-level aristocrats who just wanted to glimpse his stockinged feet. You hear the faintest rustle behind the heavy damask curtain. The bed's gold-embroidered canopy quivers. A valet leans forward. The king is stirring. First the royal wig is placed nearby. Then the bed curtains part. And finally there he is. Louis XIV, monarch of France, godlike symbol of absolute power, blinking slowly like a cat that's too rich to be startled. A murmur of respectful bows moves through the room. You do not blink too loudly. Fringe tidbit. The king's waking hour was once delayed by 20 minutes due to a rogue pigeon nesting in the chimney. Courtiers still lined up, whispering to each other about the sacred pigeon delay. The valet hands Louis his dressing robe, but not before 3 people verify it's the correct one. A duke stands ready with the slippers. A physician examines the royal pulse. A bishop waits with a polite smile and a bowl of holy water, just in case God wants to RSVP to breakfast. And everyone watches. Because this isn't about hygiene. It's about access. Being present at the king's awakening wasn't just a curiosity. It was a statement I matter enough to watch you yawn. Proximity meant influence. And influence meant everything in a world where your title could rise or fall based on who saw you hand the king a sleeve. Historians still argue whether Louis actually liked being watched, or whether he simply understood the sheer power of it. Did he genuinely enjoy these morning theatrics, or were they just a tool, a golden trap of his own making? The king shifts again. Someone in the back gasps softly. It's happening. He's about to sit up. The room tightens, breaths held like prayers. And then yes, he stretches, one arm, then the other, a dainty, regal stretch, the kind that says I slept well, but more importantly, I slept better than you. The court exhales in silent ecstasy. And the day begins. In Versailles, the bed wasn't where you escaped from power. It was where you performed it. And Louis XIV, he was the star. The king is awake. The royal bedchamber, thick with anticipation just a moment ago, now moves like a slow tide of silk and careful ego. You shuffle subtly to the left to make room for a marquis with a fancier cravat. Someone behind you clears their throat, as if trying to clear their path up the social ladder. Because in this room, even clearing your throat might be political. Mainstream fact, the Lever du Roi was divided into a series of increasingly crowded stages, with different groups of courtiers admitted in waves. It began with the Grand Lever high-ranking nobles, and continued through the Petit Lever and Entrée Familière, where even lesser courtier, petitioners, and ambitious hangers-on could try to score face time with the king while he dressed. At the centre of it all is the bed. Not just any bed, this one is a symbol, a piece of royal stagecraft, a golden, a canopied spectacle flanked by velvet ropes, marble columns, and more embroidered fleur-de-lis than should legally fit on one piece of furniture. It's where France begins every morning. Louis XIV isn't in a hurry. Why would he be? A valet fetches the slippers, another offers a basin for washing. One duke has the sacred duty of handing him his undershirt. Don't ask how many letters of recommendation were required to reach shirt-handing status. Users, meanwhile, are stuck in the third row behind someone who smells aggressively of clove and political ambition. Fringe tidbit courtiers at Versailles developed elaborate strategies to manoeuvre through these morning audiences, sometimes slipping bribes to chamber servants to be bumped up the rotation, or pretending they'd been personally summoned when they absolutely had not. The chamber is hushed, but alive. The brush of satin skirts, the clink of a golden razor, the soft rustle of powdered wigs adjusting themselves for visibility. This isn't just about witnessing a wake-up. This is power proximity theatre, and everyone is hoping for an encore. The king says nothing yet. His yawns are interpreted like royal decrees, one minister nearby murmurs. His Majesty appears contemplative today, while another whispers, no contented. Historians still argue how much influence was actually exchanged during these performances. Some believe it was pure pomp with little substance. Others claim real court appointments, favours, and secrets began right here before the man had even gotten out of bed. Louis finally speaks. It's something innocuous, perhaps a comment about the weather, or a vague request for chocolate. Either way, someone writes it down. You take a breath and realise something odd. You've forgotten what time it is. Not that it matters, because Versailles doesn't run on clocks. It runs on Louis. And until he's fully dressed, the world just waits. A servant draws back the bed's curtain a little farther. Now more faces can see him. A bishop inches closer. A young noble bows so low his wig almost falls off. This is their moment. 6 seconds of visibility they'll parlay into 6 months of dinner invitations. Fringe tidbit. It was considered a tremendous honour to hand the king his gloves, not put them on, just hand them to him. One man did this once and updated his family coat of arms to include a golden glove, because why not? A valet now holds out the waistcoat. You brace for movement. There it is. The king rises slowly, gracefully, with the kind of practiced dignity that says, I'm not just getting up, I'm ascending. And the chamber reacts like it's watching sunrise for the very first time. He steps away from the bed. And with that, the bed is no longer a bed. It's a shrine, a symbol, And for the rest of the day, nobody dares sit on it. It has done its duty. It has held the morning's most sacred ritual. And the only thing more ridiculous than what you've just seen is that it's not even halfway done. Now that the king has risen, the bed golden, enormous, and vaguely smug recedes into the background like an actor who's nailed their scene and is now waiting in the wings. It looms behind the crowd, half shrouded in embroidered velvet, while the room itself shifts its gaze towards stage 2, the dressing. But let's not forget that bed, that ridiculous and gilded 15-foot wide altar of eiderdown and egotism. It's not where Louis XIV actually sleeps. Mainstream fact. The bed in Louis XIV's public chamber at Versailles was primarily ceremonial. While it was used for certain formal moments such as royal rising, receptions, and even lying in state, it was not typically where the king actually slept. That happened in a much smaller, more private bed, in a room behind the scenes. You hear it whispered from one corner of the room, "He sleeps in the little bed." Someone scoffs. Not the little bed. They argue softly over which hidden room it is. You don't bother weighing in. Everyone knows there's a secret bed, and everyone pretends it's a secret, even though literally everyone knows. Fringe tidbit. The secret sleeping chamber was known to a select circle of staff and a few favourites. It was less glamorous, smaller, and more functional, mostly because it was the only place the king could lie down without 50 people watching his toes breathe. You trail along behind the procession as Louis moves toward the toilette, the morning ritual that involves changing into his day clothes in full view of dozens of nobles. Meanwhile, back at the official bed, valets are smoothing the covers like they're taming a dragon. No one will touch it now, except the appointed bed steward. Yes, there's a bed steward. You glance back and see him pale, reverent, gripping a feather duster like a relic. He bows before adjusting a pillow. Historians still argue whether the theatrical separation of sleeping and symbolic beds was about privacy, control, or an extension of Louis's deep understanding of spectacle. After all, a king asleep is just a man, but a king performing sleep, that's divine. The ceremonial bed remains flanked by velvet ropes, not unlike a very luxurious crime scene. No one crosses them. You wonder briefly what would happen if someone sat on the edge. Would the floor open up? Would a bishop faint? Probably both. Fringe tidbit. During one diplomatic visit, a foreign ambassador was offered the honour of standing next to the bed for 3 full minutes. He wrote home describing it as an unnerving silence beside a beast made of fabric and gold. You wander through a side alcove and peek into the adjoining chamber, the one rumoured to house the real bed. It's smaller, simpler, still luxurious. Yes, but it doesn't look like it needs a scaffolding crew to change the sheets. There's a robe tossed casually across a chair, a candle stub, a pair of worn slippers. This is where he sleeps. And for the first time, you remember Louis XIV was a human being, one who got cold at night, who needed to sneeze, who occasionally got up for water or stared at the ceiling in royal insomnia. But the court didn't want a human. They wanted the sun. So the private bed was hidden. And the grand one, lit from all sides, elevated on a dais, a set piece in a never-ending play where every pillow was a plot and every morning stretch could be a political endorsement. You return to the main chamber. The crowd has shifted again. The king's coat is being discussed by 5 men. His breakfast is being arranged by 6. And the bed, still there, still shining, still haunted by 100 pairs of eyes each morning who see in it not comfort, but opportunity. The real sleep happened in shadows. But the real power always unfolded between the sheets that no one was allowed to wrinkle. The crowd in the bedchamber moves like clockwork, but not the modern kind. More like one of those baroque, overly complicated clocks with too many golden birds popping out at strange angles and a lute-playing cherub that rings the hour slightly offbeat. In other words, this isn't chaos, it's Versailles. You stay close to the velvet rope as the next wave of courtiers enters. Each one looks slightly breathless, like they just jogged from the far end of the palace without letting their wigs tilt. Because this next stage, this is where the hierarchy gets theatrical. Mainstream fact. The lever wasn't just a ceremony, it was a finely tuned system of social ranking. Different nobles had access to different parts of the king's morning routine. Some could hand him his shirt, some could observe the handoff, others were simply permitted to stand in the back and not speak unless spoken to. Every gesture, every glance was tracked like chess. A duke near the front adjusts his lace cuffs for the 4th time in a minute. He's sweating under his powdered wig, even though it's winter. The reason he's been granted the honour of handing the king his cravat. Not tying it, just handing it. With both hands, and a subtle bow. Fringe tidbit. There were recorded instances of men fainting from joy after being promoted to assist with royal undergarments. One count reportedly had a miniature portrait made of the moment he was asked to hold the king's shoe. You shuffle slightly sideways to avoid being elbowed by a marquis who's angling for visibility. He leans forward as if trying to inhale proximity. Behind him, a lower-ranking noble silently mouths Louis's schedule like it's a prayer. There's choreography to this. You've never seen so many grown men choreographing around a bathrobe. One courtier is responsible for announcing the name of whoever is permitted to step forward and perform their task. His Grace the Duke of Bouillon Slippers. Everyone turns. The Duke steps forward like he's approaching an altar. He bows, picks up the slippers, and places them by the king's feet. The king doesn't look down. He doesn't have to, because this is not about warmth or foot support. This is about ritual, a centuries-old ballet of self-importance disguised as helpfulness. Historians still argue whether this elaborate ranking system reinforced Louis's control or simply exhausted everyone into submission. One theory suggests he used the lever to weaken the political ambitions of the nobility by keeping them obsessed with who got to button which sleeve. You watch as another nobleman is handed the comb. He doesn't use it. He just presents it like a sword to a monarch and then backs away. Meanwhile, others wait outside the room, yes. There are even more desperate for a glimpse, an entrance, or a half-second of accidental eye contact. Fringe tidbit. Some aristocrats hired spies to track who was gaining favour during the lever. They'd then arrive earlier the next day, wearing similar outfits or mimicking gestures, hoping to mimic success by osmosis. As the king sits for his morning toilette, the crowd shifts into a new formation. Some step forward, others fade back. No one lingers too long in the wrong spot. You can feel it, the quiet, unspoken law of Versailles. You move only as your rank allows, which means sometimes you don't move at all. You just stand there and pretend you're having the best morning of your life while watching a man eat a poached pear in silk slippers. It's not glamorous. It's calculated waiting. You realize now that the bed is more than a prop. It's a measuring stick, not of sleep, but of closeness, of favour, of who gets to inch forward and who stays by the door. And even though the king is now seated across the room, surrounded by silver basins and steaming cloths, and 6 advisors arguing about shoe polish. You feel the bed watching, as if it, too, remembers exactly who stood where this morning. You find yourself drifting toward the far edge of the chamber, where the velvet ropes end and the political heat begins to drop a degree or two. This is where the low-ranking nobility and assorted hopefuls congregate those who didn't make it to the inner orbit, but still showed up in powdered wigs, just in case someone sneezed and they got called forward. Mainstream fact: the number of courtiers permitted in the king's bedchamber during the lever could exceed 100. While only a handful had direct duties, many more simply stood quietly, watching, hoping that their presence alone might win favour, or at the very least, be remembered. You're standing beside a viscount who whispers to no one in particular, "I once touched the corner of the coverlet." He says this with the kind of awe usually reserved for holy relics or particularly good cheese. A moment later, another noble leans in and says, "Well, I once passed the king his handkerchief." They stare at each other. The duel is silent but fierce. Fringe Tidbit, a baron from Gascony, reportedly brought his own pillow to court for 6 months, in hopes it would be mistaken as part of the royal bed set. It wasn't. He was gently asked to stop lurking. You edge a little closer to the central action. There's a cluster of courtiers politely jostling to witness the king's breakfast, yes. Even the act of eating in bed was part of the ceremonial buffet of hierarchy. A silver tray appears, borne aloft by a steward whose expression suggests this is the most important tray of his entire career. The king accepts it without a word. You crane your neck. Hot chocolate. 3 slices of toasted bread. 1 perfectly poached egg. It's like watching someone consume a treaty. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV actually enjoyed this whole parade or merely tolerated it. Some diaries suggest he was deeply aware of its strategic importance. Others imply he sometimes got bored and made up tasks just to watch people scramble. Fringe tidbit. At least one morning, Louis reportedly asked 5 nobles to debate which napkin colour would best represent divine authority, a question that sparked a week-long feud and the invention of something called ceremonial beige. The breakfast is consumed with great dignity. You'd expect nothing less. But it's the way everyone watches him chew that gets you, the way a duke nods as if to say, "Yes, that is an admirable mastication," or how an advisor furrows his brow with philosophical intensity over whether the second sip of chocolate was longer than the first. Behind you, someone sighs. You don't look. You're too busy watching the king wipe his mouth. A footman takes the napkin as if retrieving a sacred scroll. Then a pause. And suddenly, just like that, a ripple. Louis speaks. You can't make out the words, but a dozen men nod, 3 write things down, and one looks like he's about to faint from the honour of being spoken near. It could have been about breakfast. It could have been about war. Doesn't matter. It happened next to the bed, and therefore it matters more. Because the bed, though now unoccupied, still holds court. You can feel it. Even as the king prepares to move to his next room, the courtiers around you remain fixated on the sheets, like they might offer wisdom if stared at hard enough. Fringe tidbit. Some nobles collected threads that had fallen from the royal bedspread and kept them in lockets. One claimed it cured gout. Another used his to christen a carriage horse named Louis XIV and a half. You retreat a few steps, letting the warmth of the crowd fall behind you. And in that moment, you realise this bed has done something no royal proclamation, no speech, no battle could ever do. It's made watching someone wake up the most important event in Europe. And it's not done yet. Because every morning, without fail, 100 people line up for a spot at the foot of the sheets. You step into the antechamber just off the royal bedchamber, where the air is still warm from too many powdered bodies pressed into one gilded room. It's quieter here, though not silent whispers fill the corners like dust motes. Nobles fanning themselves, adjusting their cuffs, casting glances at the heavy doors they were not quite important enough to pass through. Because in Versailles, you could be nobility and still be no one. Mainstream fact. At the height of Louis XIV's reign, the French court was a place of rigid protocol and brutal social competition. Many minor nobles relocated to Versailles, not to govern or advise, but to be seen hovering near power like moths circling a candelabra made of silk and judgment. And the fastest way to be seen: be early, be ready, be unreasonably alert. Which is why the hallway smells less like sleep and more like nerves. These are the men and women who slept in shoes, kept one eye open, and learned to lace corsets in under 2 minutes. Because if you were late to the lever, if you missed your chance to stand behind a guy who was standing behind another guy who might hand the king a sock, then you were just another anonymous wig in a country full of wigs. You see a young countess pinning a ribbon back into place with the practiced grace of someone who has done this in the dark. Beside her, a viscount mutters the king's breakfast order under his breath like a mantra. Someone nearby recites the family tree of the Duke of Burgundy, just in case. Fringe tidbit courtiers were known to position themselves in hallways as early as 3 or 4, hoping to be in line when the lever began. One baron reportedly had a footman reserve his standing spot, like a divine velvet placeholder. You catch a glimpse of a gentleman whose boots are polished to an unnatural shine. He stands still, face neutral, but his fingers twitch at his sides. He's calculating if the king looks left. I'll bow. If he looks right, I'll pretend to cough modestly. Because even gestures are strategies here. Historians still argue whether Versailles truly drained the political power of the nobility, or simply forced it to evolve into a subtler form. Some suggest Louis XIV's greatest achievement wasn't war or architecture, but the invention of bureaucratic theatre, where nobles fought not with swords, but with timing, posture, and proximity to pyjamas. Someone moves to open the outer chamber door, and there's a ripple of motion. A duchess subtly adjusts her smile. A marquis shifts his weight so he's half blocking the nearest candlelight because dramatic lighting is half the battle. But then the page says, "Not yet," and everyone freezes. Fringe tidbit. At least 3 duels were recorded in Versailles over minor spots in the royal morning lineup. One occurred over a misinterpreted shoe cue. Another over a man who claimed he could smell the king's cologne first. He could not. You lean against the tapestry-lined wall and watch them. The barely blinking eyes. The shoes buffed to mirror-like glaze. The fingers curled politely at their sides, like loaded crossbows waiting for the right glance. All of them desperate to be summoned to the bed. Not to lie on it or even sit near it. Just to exist inside its gravitational pull for one glorious, silky second. You wonder, do any of them sleep? Like, actually sleep. When everything that matters happens before dawn, sleep becomes optional, or at least negotiable. And that's how Versailles worked. Not on rest, but on readiness. Not on dreams, but on calculated awakenings. Because while Louis was the one in bed, everyone else was wide awake, waiting for the sheets to rustle. The king is now fully dressed, every button examined, every sash fluffed, every buckle gleaming just slightly more than the one before it, and as he makes his way toward the salon for the next phase of his mourning, a hush falls across the chamber once again. But you stay behind for a moment, because something is happening with the bed. The crowd has thinned. The nobility are drifting out to resume their daily swirl of bowing, gossiping, and pretending not to elbow each other in hallways. But a select few, just a handful, remain clustered near the foot of the bed, and you suddenly understand. This isn't over. Mainstream fact, Louis XIV's royal bed was not just a symbol of his mourning lever. Throughout the day, it remained a political beacon. Nobles might still gather near it to await royal audiences, make social calculations, or just stand around radiating practiced reverence. You edge closer. There's a man with a bald patch shining through his powdered hair, holding a leather-bound notebook with far too many ribbons in it. He's whispering the names of tulip species as if they're coded diplomatic titles. A lady in green silk curtsies faintly toward the bed. Not the king, he's long gone. The bed. It has a presence now. Like it's watching them back. Fringe tidbit. There were designated officials who maintained and guarded the royal bed during the day. Yes, bed guardians. Their responsibilities included adjusting pillows, straightening sheets, and if necessary, gently reminding overly eager visitors that lying down was, and we quote, a treasonous misreading of etiquette. One man leans slightly on the bedpost. Immediately, a steward clears his throat. The man steps back. Order is restored. You notice the way people orbit the bed. No one turns their back to it. Even as they leave, there's a strange courtesy like backing away from an altar or a mildly vengeful ghost. Historians still argue whether the bed was considered an extension of the king's body or merely a potent symbol of his power. Some called it a golden threshold. Others just referred to it half reverently, half ironically as the furniture that watches. You hear someone say, "He rested well last night," as though reporting on divine weather. Another murmurs, "The pillows were changed. That's a good sign." And you realize this bed has a public relations team. Fringe tidbit. A noble woman once commissioned a painting of herself fainting near the king's bed. It was titled The Fragrance of Sovereignty, and yes, it featured angels holding up the canopy with pink ribbons. You move to the side of the chamber, where a new group has entered, freshly powdered, freshly hopeful. They haven't come to see the king. They've come to be near the mattress. Because being near it means something. It means they were present. That they hovered close to a place where power once reclined. That perhaps someone might say, later at supper, "Didn't I see you near the left bedpost this morning? What luck." You glance at the headboard carved with suns and stars. Of course, because Louis was never one for subtlety and notice a small embroidered detail, a crown, nestled in laurels, half faded with time. It's still intimidating, still imperial, still smug, because it knows. This bed has outlasted wars, revolts, broken alliances, and at least 3 mistresses who tried to smuggle in notes under the sheets. It has seen more ambition than a chessboard, and more whispered schemes than a confessional. And now, it just sits there, silent, majestic, a plush monument to proximity. The room begins to clear once more, but not completely. There's always someone, one hopeful marquis, one half-asleep duchess, one slow-stepping baron just lingering, just long enough to say they were almost the last to leave. You step carefully through the next chamber, leaving behind the velvet ropes and reverent murmurs, only to discover something you didn't quite expect: another bed. It's tucked discreetly into an adjoining alcove, barely larger than a modest couch, draped in simple linen rather than gilded brocade. No crowd, no canopy, no steward brushing invisible specks from the pillow with a feather fan. And here's the twist: this is the bed the king actually slept in. Mainstream fact: while the ceremonial bed in the grand bedchamber served as a stage for public display, Louis XIV typically slept in a much smaller, private bed, one situated in a more secure, modestly adorned room behind the scenes. It allowed for actual rest, guarded solitude, and the ability to dodge 70 spectators if necessary. There's a chamberlain by the doorway with a keyring the size of a melon. He nods to you with the quiet air of someone who's heard too many late-night footsteps and too few thanks. Inside, the lighting is softer. The air smells faintly of wax and wool, not perfume and politics. There's a writing desk, some folded sheets, a pair of worn slippers, one slightly scuffed at the toe. The Sun King here? Yes, because even a monarch must eventually stop performing. Fringe tidbit: Louis was known to occasionally retreat to this private bed unannounced, usually when exhausted by endless court ritual or when seeking solitude from palace intrigue. Once, a royal painter arrived to sketch him and was gently told, "His Majesty is asleep where no brush follows." You walk around the small bed's edge and find something strangely endearing: a reading lamp with a crooked shade, and beside it, a copy of a devotional prayer book, its corners dog-eared. There's no mural above this bed. No carved cherubs. Just a ceiling. Plain, white, still. You wonder, did he sleep better here? Historians still argue how much true rest Louis XIV ever got. Some describe him as a master of ritual and composure who only feigned vulnerability. Others suggest he was deeply aware of the cost of kingship and sought peace, in places no crown could follow, like this narrow bed, behind locked doors, after midnight. Fringe tidbit: an apothecary once recorded that the king's most requested bedtime items were warm milk, dried plums, and one hot brick, wrapped for the feet. Royal, yes, but also deeply human. You sit for a moment on a stool near the wall. It creaks. The only creak you've heard all day. Because in this space, the palace exhales. The whispers are gone. The velvet has stopped rustling. There are no dukes rehearsing polite coughs, no courtiers angling to hand over a robe, just four walls and a quiet bed, and maybe, if you listen long enough, the faint memory of a man sighing. Not because he's rehearsing it for a crowd, but because he's tired. The contrast hits you fully now. The gold-drenched bed out there, that's where the king woke up. This one, that's where Louis closed his eyes. And you feel something shift. Not dramatically, not in the way of trumpets or chamber music, but like a feather settling on still water. Fringe tidbit: there was a brief scandal when a valet mistakenly allowed a lower-ranking courtier to glimpse this private bed. The man claimed it smelled of lavender and destiny. He was exiled for over-romanticizing upholstery. You rise and quietly step back toward the public halls. The noise returns: clipped heels, hushed laughter, the occasional shriek of someone being corrected about protocol. The stage is back in full swing. But now you know. There was another side. A simpler place. A bed where no one watched. Where power lay still for a few hours each night. Before the gold sheets were tucked in again, the slippers polished, and the whole performance prepared for another round. Because being a king was exhausting. And sometimes, even the sun had to sleep. By now, the grand bedchamber is empty again, save for one man dusting the base of a chair with obsessive reverence. The crowd has moved on to court matters, tiny wars disguised as banquets, delicate insults wrapped in compliments about lace, and theatrical gasps at the mention of taxes. But for a few moments each morning, it's the bed that holds the throne. And sometimes, when the stars align and the candles behave, breakfast is served there too. Mainstream fact, Louis XIV often ate his breakfast a light meal of chocolate, fruit, or broth, while still seated nearer on the ceremonial bed. This event was no less observed than the lever itself, and yes, multiple courtiers were allowed, even encouraged, to attend, because apparently the sound of royal chewing was considered politically significant. You sit in one of the chairs along the wall, half expecting the bed to address you directly at this point. The mattress creaks once, probably just settling, or judging. A footman enters with a tray, places it reverently on the side table, and retreats like someone tiptoeing away from a sleeping tiger wearing brocade. On the tray, a golden cup of hot chocolate, a napkin folded with mathematical precision, and 2 slices of toast so perfectly buttered they seem unreal. You stare. Not at the food, but at the arrangement. Even here, every crumb has rank. Fringe tidbit. The king's breakfast tray was sometimes presented with a miniature coat of arms iced into a biscuit, or with decorative fruit arranged to resemble a royal crest. There's even mention of an orange spiral of modesty, no explanation given, and frankly, none needed. This isn't just breakfast. It's edible symbolism. A page walks in, sees you sitting too close, and subtly coughs until you adjust your posture. Even unoccupied, the bed has its aura. You feel like you should apologize to it for not curtsying. Historians still debate whether these mealtime performances were truly effective tools of statecraft or merely indulgences on a divine scale. Some argue they reinforced absolutism through repetition. Others say they were, quite simply, the earliest form of royal reality television. There's a memory here, too, of when breakfast went wrong. Fringe tidbit. One morning, the royal chocolate was too thick. The server, to trembling, blamed a cow. It sparked a 10-day inquiry, a satirical poem, and an opera called The Cacao Catastrophe. It was not performed again. The napkin is monogrammed. Of course. The butter knife has a miniature sun carved into its hilt. Naturally. And the cut porcelain from the royal manufactory, commissioned specifically so that Louis's upper lip wouldn't be stained by cocoa. Priorities. You remember reading somewhere that guests at court could request the honour of watching the king eat. Not dining with him, not conversing, just watching as he bit into toast with the same careful gravity as a man signing a treaty. And here, sitting in silence next to that glorious, over-decorated, emotionally manipulative bed, it all makes sense. Because to watch Louis XIV eat near this bed was not just proximity to power. It was proximity to ritual, to consistency, to a world where everything had a place. Even toast. You hear distant voices now. Someone outside is discussing wigs. Another complains about the draftiness of the gallery. And still, in here, it's all velvet hush and quiet crumbs. You rise slowly, because even though the king has gone, the space is still sacred. The bed remains. The breakfast remains. The rules remain. And all of it, just for one man, to wake up, stretch, and maybe have a slice of buttered immortality. You leave behind the golden tray, the crustless toast, and the haunting gaze of a bed that somehow judges you even while unoccupied. The chamber door closes gently behind you with a sound like folded parchment. And now you're walking down a narrower hall, less polished, more perfumed, softer carpet, and something you did not expect to crowd near a chamber pot. Mainstream fact. Among the many peculiar court rituals, Louis XIV's daily toilet, yes, his bathroom break was also observed by courtiers. Attending la petite toilette du roi was a genuine social privilege. There were assigned roles, ceremonial etiquette, and at least 2 people whose only job was to hand the king a scented cloth. You step closer and realize this is not satire. This is logistics. A valet stands with military posture near a finely carved wooden chair that, unfortunately, doubles as a very royal lavatory. A bishop stands nearby, holding a scroll and looking anywhere but down. 2 noblemen quietly debate which saint governs digestion. Fringe tidbit, one aristocrat claimed his greatest honour at court was being allowed to carry the chamber pot lid during Lent. He included this fact in his will. The scent is mostly masked by incense and rosewater, though there's a definite undertone of reality. Even kings, after all, are human. Though in Louis's case, even the process of proof had to be stage-managed. You sidestep a group of minor dukes who've clearly arrived just to hover in the hallway, hoping for a glimpse or a sniff of relevance. They lean casually against the panelling, as if to say, "Oh, me, I was just nearby. Definitely not here for the royal bathroom schedule." But they are. Of course they are. Because being part of every aspect of the king's day, even the intimate, even the intestinal, meant influence. It meant access. Historians still argue whether Louis encouraged this level of exposure for political reasons, or whether he simply accepted it as the price of absolute monarchy. Was it part of the control, or did he find it vaguely amusing to make 50 men watch him sip prune broth? Fringe tidbit. The royal chair had a small drawer for writing paper and a nearby bell pull, just in case the king was struck with inspiration or indecision mid-process. Several minor treaties were allegedly drafted between pauses. The king is not currently in the room, thank heavens, but the ritual is being prepared with all the pomp of a coronation. A cushion is fluffed, a curtain is adjusted, a towel is ironed by hand with a stone warmed in a silver pan. And through it all, the attendants maintain the kind of solemn dignity you normally reserve for funerals or very difficult crosswords. You glance over and see someone tucking fresh lavender into the floor tiles. Someone else adjusts the candlelight to a flattering angle. You wonder, was this madness? Or had the court simply run out of reasonable things to control, and so began polishing the absurd? Fringe tidbit, one court diary records a moment where the king asked, "Do I not cast shadows as well as light?" Some believe he meant it poetically. Others think he was literally referring to how the window hit the chamber pot. You back away, careful not to interrupt a servant who's polishing the brass latch on the toilet stand. Because that's the world Versailles built, where no moment was private, no act unobserved, where power was so concentrated, even bowel movements required a guest list. You re-enter the hallway feeling strangely awed, not by the gold or the ritual, but by the fact that, despite all the lace and incense trying to fight the lace, this was still a man who yawned. who winced, who, perhaps more than anyone, had learned the uncomfortable truth that in a world where every breath was a performance, there was no such thing as being off stage. The sun has risen high above Versailles now, slanting through tall windows and catching on gold leaf cornices like it, too, wants to be seen by the king. You drift past a gallery of silent portraits, faces frozen mid-smirk, and follow a narrow corridor that opens into yet another chamber, soft with tapestries and scandal. Because now we arrive at the other reason Louis's bed always had visitors. Let's talk about company. Mainstream fact, Louis XIV was famously not alone in his sleeping quarters. In addition to his valet and guards stationed nearby, he was also frequently joined, either publicly acknowledged or quietly whispered about, by mistresses, companions, or noble guests. Royal intimacy was often semi-public, symbolic, or diplomatically useful. You lean against a marble column and watch as a maid rushes past, clutching a small bottle of jasmine oil. Her cheeks are pink, her eyes dart. She says nothing, but her direction tells you everything. Someone is in the private bedchamber. Fringe tidbit. The king's romantic schedule was sometimes recorded as meticulously as his wardrobe. One entry simply reads, Madame de Maintenon arrived with fan, departed with prayer book. You turn the corner just in time to catch the rustle of silk behind a curtain. Two noble women look up and whisper behind gloved hands. You don't need to hear the words. You already know the script. Was it her, this morning? No, last night. Was she seen leaving? The royal bed was many things a symbol, a stage, a political prize, but it was also a place of soft whispers and hard diplomacy. Because in Versailles, even romance was administrative. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV's many affairs were driven by passion, politics, or a theatrical understanding of monarchy as performance. His acknowledged mistresses wielded real influence, though often behind curtains, beside beds, or through servants' side doors. You move further down the corridor where a tapestry hangs crooked just enough to suggest someone slipped behind it recently. Behind that, a discreet door, often used by guests who are meant to be forgotten by sunrise. Fringe tidbit. At least one mistress was known to leave her glove on the royal nightstand as a subtle message to rivals. This sparked a series of glove-themed retaliations, including a brief moment in 1682 known as La Guerre des Mains. You pause at the door and imagine the quiet breath of the palace at night. The guards dozing in hallways, the soft padding of slippers down candlelit floors, the gentle creak of a mattress, the low hush of a voice saying something meant for no one else to hear. And then, come morning, the lever begins, and the entire theatre resets. Because what happened in the night beneath embroidered canopies and behind bolted doors still mattered, but it had to be translated into gestures, into rumours, into sudden promotions. A new title for her cousin, a favourable contract for his uncle, all because someone had the king's ear, and maybe his hand, for a few quiet hours. You hear distant laughter now, court ladies playing a lute badly and pretending it's charming. Someone is dancing, or possibly just tripping in rhythm. A page walks past with a tray of wine and an expression of practiced neutrality. Because discretion is a virtue in Versailles. But silence, that's for commoners. Here, everything gets noticed. Especially the people who leave the king's bed looking a little too proud. Fringe tidbit. The royal laundry staff once discovered an unsigned note stitched into a handkerchief reading, "He still calls me the moon." It became a court riddle for weeks, No one confessed. 3 poems were written. 1 wig was set on fire. Unrelated. Probably. You walk back toward the main hall. The ceremonial bed is quiet now. Its pillows unruffled. Its canopy catching the last light of the morning. But the bed behind the curtain, that one's still warm. And someone, maybe several someones, is already calculating what it might be worth. You take a turn down a corridor so quiet it hums. No silk swish, no gossip pinging off gilded panels, just the faint creak of boots and the scent of wax-polished floors. Here, you've found the people who don't perform around the king's bed. They protect it. Mainstream fact, Louis XIV was guarded day and night by the king's household troops' elite men, assigned not just to his public image, but to his person. Some even slept just outside the door of his private chamber. Security at Versailles was as layered and ritualized as the court itself, though still, from time to time, people slipped in where they shouldn't. You nod at a man in gleaming boots, standing statue still next to an ornate doorframe. He blinks once in 20 seconds and does not acknowledge you otherwise. He's part of the watch. And in a palace where everyone wants to be seen by the king, these are the men trained to disappear. Fringe Tidbit, royal guards assigned to night duty, developed their own subtle language of coughs, foot taps, and fabric flicks to communicate silently during the king's sleep. One version of his stirring involved deliberately dropping a quill at half volume. You pass 2 guards changing shift. They don't speak. One nods, the other adjusts his sword with surgical precision. You can't help but wonder, did they ever glance into the bedchamber, or did they train themselves to ignore the gold-drenched canopy as if it were a lion in a wig? You peek into an adjacent chamber less polished, more practical. A low table holds a stack of logs for the hearth. A kettle boils faintly in the corner. This is the readiness room, just in case the king wakes up thirsty, or cold, or worried about taxes. Historians still debate how secure the Sun King truly was in his own palace. Despite all the ritual and presents, Versailles had its breaches, secret passages, hidden letters, the occasional unsanctioned visit. Some claim the theatre distracted from real vulnerability. Others argue it was the security and overwhelming, beautiful distraction. Fringe Tidbit. On one occasion, a servant disguised as a valet snuck into the outer chamber hoping to slip a love poem beneath the royal pillow. He was discovered, interrogated, and promptly reassigned to the chicken coop. His poem was later found stuffed into a candelabra and read aloud at a drunken banquet. You find another guard, older, standing beside a locked cabinet. What's in there, you ask? He doesn't answer. He just rests a hand on the cabinet and says, "Not for you." Fair enough. In a palace of talkers, silence carries weight. You wander further and the light changes slightly. It's less reflective or more real. And there it is. A cot. Not the royal bed. A soldier's bed. Small, stiff, tucked into a niche behind the main wall. A place for someone to sleep lightly. Or not at all. You imagine the nights here. A cough echoing down stone, the shifting of footfalls, a whisper passing through fabric-covered panels, and always, always, a man sleeping or pretending to near the bed of the king. Fringe Tidbit, one royal guard, admitted in his private diary that his greatest fear was not assassination but snoring. "Should I ever wake His Majesty with a snore," he wrote, "I shall walk straight into the lake with my boots on." Back in the main passage, you see a seam in the wall disguised as panelling, a servant's door, used for food, messages, sometimes escape. Not everything in Versailles went according to plan, and not everyone came through the front. You lean against the cold marble wall and think about the absurd contrast. On one side of the door, velvet perfume, silk fans, and courtly smiles. On this side, men with blades, tea gone cold, and eyes trained to detect footsteps behind walls. Because while most dreamed of touching the royal sheets, these were the ones who kept the dreams from unravelling. It's evening now. The light in Versailles has shifted, mellowing into honey-coloured pools on parquet floors, stretching shadows across the tapestries, turning gold leaf into quiet flame. You walk the familiar corridor toward the grand bedchamber, only to find the door slightly ajar. Inside, everything has changed. The day's heat has settled into the sheets. The room smells like candle wax, crushed violets, and the faintest trace of roasted pheasant from supper. No crowd, no courtiers, just a few flickering sconces, a folded robe on a chair, and the gentle, rhythmic breath of stillness. It's time for the coucher. Mainstream fact. Just as the king's morning rising was a formal ceremony, so too was his nightly cocher, the ritual of going to bed. This was a tightly choreographed performance, often attended by dozens of courtiers, with precise rules about who could hand the king his nightshirt or fluff the final pillow. You sit near the edge of the chamber, behind a velvet cord, of course. No one sits close to the bed uninvited. That privilege is reserved for those with the official rank of "watch me take off my buckles." The king enters. He's slower now, his elaborate heels striking the floor with authority tinged by gravity. His wig has been traded for a lighter one, or maybe none at all. His eyes scan the room once, and then he exhales. You recognize that breath. It's the sigh of someone who's carried the weight of 1,000 eyes since dawn. Fringe tidbit, Louis once dozed off during his own coucher. Two dukes spent 10 minutes debating whether to remove his slippers or let him sleep fully dressed. They eventually compromised by removing one slipper and assigning a poem to the moment. The ritual begins. First, the coat is removed by the gentleman of the wardrobe. Then, the waistcoat passed to the master of the closet. Next comes the ceremonial handing of the nightshirt, an event so politically charged it could make or ruin a man's future. Tonight, it's handed by the Duke of something or other, whose hands tremble slightly as he bows so low you wonder if he might unfold backward. The king changes. You don't look away. No one does. 'Cause here, undressing is performance. It's not about comfort. It's about presence, hierarchy, being allowed to witness the last moment before the sun goes dark for the night. Historians still debate whether the couche was more personal or political. Some argue it gave the king rare, private contact with his inner circle. Others point out the inherent absurdity of 40 men watching someone brush his teeth while standing on crushed velvet. Fringe tidbit one night. A noble tripped on the hem of the king's dressing robe and accidentally yanked it. He was exiled the next day not for the stumble, but for failing to apologize with sufficient poetic flair. Louis moves toward the bed. You can't help noticing it's already turned down. The pillows are fluffed. The coverlet folded at a perfect diagonal. A valet holds the edge open like a curtain at the opera. The king steps in slowly, like a man entering his own monument. He reclines. A servant tucks the sheets, carefully but not too tightly. Another places a small silver bell within reach. And then it happens. The final bow. Everyone, from dukes to guards, bows in silent unity. No one speaks unless the king says something. Tonight he simply nods, eyes closed. already elsewhere. You're ushered out with the others, but not hurried, because this is sacred. And even the hallways seem to lower their voices. Fringe tidbit. The candle closest to the king's bed was always snuffed last, and only by the premier valet de chambre. A different servant once tried to do it as a surprise, and was demoted to paltry detail. As the door closes, you hear nothing. No court laughter. No lute playing. Just stillness. And behind that grand door, surrounded by finery and tradition and 30 feet of drapery, the king sleeps. Or pretends to. Because even now, even in rest, the stage is still lit. And the bed still watches. You step away from the royal bedchamber into the cooling hush of Versailles at night. Somewhere down the corridor, a harpsichord plays the same melody it's played for 30 years light, repetitive, and just sleepy enough to make you question whether you're dreaming. The halls are dim now, the candles softened behind amber glass. And yet, movement. Because not everyone sleeps after the coucher. Some begin their true work. The mainstream fact. The nighttime corridors of Versailles were not quiet voids. They were alive with whispers, notes passed under doors, carefully timed footsteps, and nobles sneaking into one another's rooms for political gain or personal indulgence. The coucher may have marked the king's rest, but it was the courtiers' prime time. You walk behind a pair of chatting ladies who lower their voices as soon as they reach a shadowed alcove. One produces a fan not to cool herself, but to block her lips from being read by anyone watching. Fringe tidbit, fan placement and tapping patterns became a kind of unofficial code among court women. Covering the left cheek meant yes. Tapping the right wrist meant meet me near the tapestries. Misinterpreting a signal could result in the wrong lover and a very awkward supper. You duck into a gallery lined with windows. Outside, the moon throws its light across the gardens, but you're focused on the silhouettes inside soft-moving figures gliding past doorways, pausing at intersections, knocking once, then again, then not at all. Because this is Versailles after hours. No duels, no shouting, just velvet and strategy. Historians still argue whether nighttime activity at court truly altered royal policy, or simply provided distraction for a bored elite. What's certain is that many promotions, favours, and sudden banishments could be traced back to conversations that began after candles dimmed. You turn a corner and spot a young noble holding a tray of wrapped pastries. At midnight, you ask no questions. He nods once and disappears through a servant's door. A few steps later, you see a door close just a little too slowly. Fringe tidbit. Entire novels were smuggled through Versailles disguised as bedtime letters, handwritten notes laced with flirtation, philosophy, and, in one case, a very explicit recipe for almond tart that got someone demoted for culinary insolence. You keep walking, your footsteps muffled by layered rugs. A trio of young lords passes you in silence, all dressed slightly too finely for sleep. One has a bottle, one has a limp, one's missing a shoe. None acknowledge you. They're off to a chamber not their own. Perhaps to discuss art. Or overthrow someone's cousin. Or flirt badly with someone else's wife. It's Versailles. All three are possible. You find yourself near the king's private bedchamber again. The door is closed, the room behind it dark, but two guards remain stationed at either side motionless, but utterly awake. You wonder how many secrets they've absorbed simply by being the furniture with ears. You glance down the far corridor, and for a moment, you spot her just a glimpse. A woman in shadow, barefoot, holding her shoes. She walks quickly, lightly. Not running, but faster than someone who's confident she'll be missed. She disappears behind a panel before you can see her face. Fringe Tidbit Versailles employed dozens of hidden passageways to allow staff and favoured guests to enter or exit rooms without using the main halls. These passages were often narrow, poorly lit, and extremely efficient at avoiding unwanted witnesses. You sigh, resting your hand on the cool marble of a doorframe. Because this palace doesn't sleep. It pauses. It shifts. It waits until the king has closed his eyes. And then it whispers. Deals are made. Bonds are tested. And sometimes a future is rewritten over candlelight and champagne in someone else's dressing gown. You walk back toward your quarters if you have one, or maybe you'll just wander a little longer, because every hallway holds its own unscripted story. But the king's bed, that's done for the night, until dawn breaks, and the slippers are warmed, and the crowd gathers once more. Because morning always comes, and the theatre will begin again. The moon hangs high above Versailles now, casting long silver stripes across the gardens like nature's version of royal carpet runners. The fountains have quieted, the birds are asleep. Even the perfume of the flower beds has cooled into something less eager. But inside things stir. Because in the palace, not all footsteps are equal, and at this hour, some of them are wearing velvet slippers with secrets sewn into the soles. Mainstream fact. While many of Versailles' courtiers were confined to structured appearances and rigid etiquette, there existed a quiet undercurrent of nighttime ambition. Some nobles cultivated entire second lives after sunset, meeting in private salons, composing secret letters, or whispering carefully rehearsed agendas into the right or wrong ears. You move through a lesser-used hallway now, where the tapestries aren't quite as grand, and the candelabras burn with shorter wicks. The walls are thinner here, more honest. And you hear it a knock, not a firm one, just a soft double tap. A door opens. A breath. A slippered foot disappears into the dark. Fringe Tidbit courtiers developed a complex etiquette for unannounced night visits. 3 knocks meant friendly, 2 meant urgent, 4 meant romantic, though the odds of misinterpretation were so high that many simply resorted to humming a signature tune outside the door. You follow at a respectful distance, not because you're spying, this isn't intrigue. This is anthropology, because this is what happens after the coucher. The king sleeps, but the palace conspires. A young gentleman exits the salon with his cravat undone and a knowing grin. A lady down the hall adjusts her neckline and pretends to be inspecting a tapestry about Greek myth. Both pass each other without speaking. They're from rival families. Still, the smile is mutual. You step into a side room where a fire still burns, and 3 low-ranking nobles are playing cards in absolute silence. Every movement is deliberate. One sips wine, one scratches his knee, the other sets down a queen and says, "If the Maréchal blinks twice tomorrow, it means a new alliance." Fringe tidbit secret phrases passed in court were often tied to bodily gestures. One 17th century diary documents an entire scandal sparked when a count unknowingly wiped his nose in a way that meant "I accept your bribe." You glance at the timepiece on the mantel. It's nearly 2. And yet, the palace doesn't yawn. It simply slows. You pass a lady scribbling furiously at a desk. Her page watches the door. She's writing what appears to be a poem, though her quill is dipped in red ink and her metre is suspiciously legal. You pause near the tapestry gallery. Two footmen whisper by the window, hands behind their backs. You hear the word inheritance and the phrase, "he won't last the winter." Keep moving, because to linger too long in anyone's shadow here is to become a part of the rumour. Historians still argue whether Versailles was more of a court or a stage. Some say Louis XIV successfully turned the nobility into his supporting cast, distracting them with velvet roles while he held the script. Others suggest the show became too large to control, and by nightfall, every minor character had their own subplot. Fringe tidbit. At least one well-known affair at Versailles lasted 6 months, purely through footnotes in borrowed books. Margins became love letters. Underlines became confessions. A librarian caught them and joined in his edits, added plot twists. You return once more to the central axis of the palace. The hallway that leads to the king's chamber is now completely silent. 2 guards remain, but one is seated, the other dozing lightly with his hand still resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. The light beneath the king's door is out. At last. The final script has ended. You wonder if he's truly asleep, or simply lying there, eyes open, knowing that even now his bed is the only one in France that has its own gravitational pull. Because while the rest of the court may sneak, write, whisper, and scheme, they still dream of being invited to the edge of that mattress. Even just once. Even just to hold the slippers. And maybe if fate smiles to fluff the pillow, it's morning again. The sky is stretching into a pale blue above the gardens, and the birds who frankly care nothing for court rankings have resumed their usual gossipy chorus. You retrace your steps toward the royal chambers, where the smell of beeswax polish and something vaguely lavender hangs in the air. The guards are shifting on their feet. A valet is already checking the warmth of the fireplace, and you can feel it, that gentle, tremulous buzz in the palace that says, "It's almost lever time again." Mainstream fact, the lever du roi, like most rituals in Louis XIV's court, occurred every single day with minor variations but major expectations. Attending it even once was a mark of extreme favour, regular attendance, a full-time political job. You watch as noblemen arrive early, eyes puffy but hair perfect. One of them yawns behind a satin-gloved hand. Another mutters a Latin phrase under his breath that roughly translates to, "May I be chosen to touch the shirt today." The doors creak open, and inside the stage is being reset. The bed is still empty, but its drapes have been fluffed, the pillow turned, the slippers placed just slightly askew at the foot, not for sloppiness, but so they can be ceremonially adjusted during the performance. The steward of linens inspects the hem of the coverlet. You glance to your right and notice a group of minor lords practicing their posture against the wall. One keeps pivoting to find his most flattering bow angle. Another discreetly checks his reflection in a silver tray. Fringe tidbit, one courtier wrote an entire instructional guide on how to stand during the lever, including diagrams for optimizing chin position and tips for appearing attentive without looking overly hungry. The room quiets. You can feel the breath holding. And then movement. The rustle of a curtain. A yawn. A royal murmur. He's awake. The same king who dozed behind he locked doors hours ago now re-enters the world not as a man, but as a spectacle. You spot the bed steward practically vibrating with joy. Today, he will lift the blanket corner during the premiere lever. He adjusts his gloves twice and mouths a silent prayer. Historians still argue whether the repetition of these rituals created order or insanity. Some saw the lever as a genius method of centralized control, reducing powerful nobles into glorified valets. Others believed the sheer absurdity kept courtiers compliant out of confusion more than fear. Fringe a tidbit. At least one noble developed a fake fainting routine designed to elicit sympathy and attention during the more crowded levers. It worked. Once. After the second attempt, he was politely relocated near the stables. The king rises slowly, and the room leans in. A robe is offered, slippers are set straight, a wig freshly powdered and humming with dignity is placed nearby. Someone clears their throat too enthusiastically and is quietly nudged backward by a duchess with deadly elbows. You realize you've seen this before, and yet it still feels monumental. Because that bed, just a piece of furniture in theory, has become a lighthouse. The nobility orbits it like the moon around the earth. Every bow, gesture, and exhale is coordinated in its glowing presence. Fringe tidbit. Some superstitious courtiers believe touching the bed curtains before the lever would bring good luck in court lotteries. The velvet had to be touched 3 times, each during a different moon phase. One man claimed it cured his gout. He was later seen limping anyway. The lever ends. The king is dressed. The crowd parts. And you step back into the corridor, now full again with hopeful murmurs, missed opportunities, and the promise of another chance tomorrow. Because the performance never ends. The slippers are collected. The bed is retucked. And a steward hums softly as he brushes an invisible crumb from the coverlet. Because he knows, as do you, this bed, it isn't a place to sleep. It's a throne made horizontal, and every morning it rises again outside the palace. The gardens stretch in full sun, geometric and obedient, just the way Louis liked them. The fountains bubble politely. The hedges are clipped with such precision they might as well be under surveillance. But inside, back in the bedchamber, the air still holds something different. Something heavy. Because one day the Sun King would not rise. And the bed would witness that too. Mainstream fact. In the final days of his life, Louis XIV remained in the same ceremonial bed where he'd performed countless levers, couchers, and symbolic stretches. His death, like his life, was public attended by physicians, courtiers, and officials. Even dying, he remained the centerpiece of the French court's choreography. You re-enter the chamber slowly. The gold is still there. The drapes still magnificent. But now there's quiet. The king lies still, not in slumber, but in slow decline. The crowd has thinned not from disinterest, but from reverence and fear. The whispers are softer now, the footfalls more padded. Even the courtiers have put down their fans and adopted the posture of people not yet sure what comes next. Fringe tidbit. During his final illness in 1715, Louis's condition was reported on a schedule, almost like weather. Courtiers waited for updates in groups, wagering discreetly on how many days he had left. One noblewoman reportedly fainted not from grief, but because she bet wrong. You sit on a stool near the wall. The windows are partially shuttered. The breeze doesn't dare enter. Physicians cluster near the headboard. Their wigs droop. Their faces are pinched. They speak in Latin so the servants won't panic. You see one of them tuck a cloth under the king's chin with the care of a man preserving a myth. Historians still debate how much pain Louis XIV endured at the end. He suffered from gangrene, gout, and a variety of ailments that would make a modern chart look like a horror novel. Some say he bore it with stoic grace. Others say he winced but never let the court see him sweat. Fringe tidbit. One rumour claimed that during his final week, Louis ordered a priest to recite his own genealogy aloud to remind God who he was. Whether it's true or not, someone definitely embroidered it into a handkerchief. The nobles watch quietly. Some cry. Some pray. One quietly updates a list of allies and enemies based on who is standing closest to the bed. Because even now, the politics haven't entirely stopped. This is Versailles, after all. You stand and look upon the bed. It doesn't look smaller now, or sadder. Just heavier. Like it knows. Because this bed has seen too much not to understand what's ending. The days of pageantry, of ceremonies performed with breathless joy, of nobles vying for the honour of handing someone a nightshirt. It's all folding inward now, into these sheets. This final sigh. Fringe tidbit, the Sun King reportedly said, "Near the end I depart, but the state shall remain." A valet cried, a marquis noted it down. A footman tripped over a chamber pot while backing out of the room. And still, amid all of it, the bed remains the same. Golden, quiet, massive, as though built to hold not just a king, but an era. And when it's over, the king's body will lie in state upon it. Visitors will pass. Bows will be offered. Tears, perhaps. But mostly awe. Because no one forgets the bed that held the beginning and the end. And tomorrow, after the funeral, it will be remade, the sheets refreshed, the curtains reopened. Because kings may die, but beds like this are immortal. You return to the grand bedchamber a few days later, expecting it to be hushed with mourning, but you're met with something stranger busyness. The floor has been swept twice. The bed linens have been changed. The cushions, yes. The same cushions where Louis XIV once reclined like a solar deity wrapped in embroidery are now being politely fluffed by a man humming under his breath. Because the king may be gone, but the bed remains employed. Mainstream fact. After Louis XIV's death in 1715, the rituals of Versailles didn't vanish. They adapted. His successor, Louis XV, continued the traditions of the livre and coucher, albeit with a few tweaks. The bed stayed put, the velvet was dusted, and a new sunrise was installed. You watch as a young servant smooths the edge of the blanket with hands trembling ever so slightly. He wasn't around when the Sun King was in his prime, but he knows what this bed means. They all do. The bed is no longer just furniture. It's an institution. Fringe tidbit after Louis XIV's death. At least 2 courtiers wrote poems addressed directly to the bed. One opened with the line, "You held the sun, now hold the stars." It was widely mocked, privately envied. You wander the room. It's quieter now, not because people aren't here they are, but because the whispers have shifted. No more questions like, will he name me maître d'hôtel? Now it's, will the new king rise at 7, or does he prefer cocoa or broth? Because the real question isn't whether the ceremony will continue. It's who gets to star in it next. Historians still debate whether Louis XIV's successors truly matched his control over the court. Louis XV kept the rituals, but lacked the Sun King's sheer gravity. Louis XVI tried too, but by then, the gilded bedposts had outlived much of the credibility. Fringe tidbit. During Louis XV's reign, one valet was caught rehearsing the livre with friends late at night using a broom for the king and a pillow as the ceremonial shoe. He was briefly dismissed, then reinstated after an apology poem was recited in iambic hexameter. You lean on the familiar wall panelling and observe. The bed still dominates the space. The canopy is cleaned. The steps are polished. The curtain ties have been replaced not because they were worn, but because the mood must evolve. And the crowd, they're ready to perform again. Different wigs, same ambitions. A new marquis enters and scans the room, clearly measuring where he'll stand. You can almost hear his thoughts. Third row, left. No, too dim. Beside the candle. Perfect. Smouldering and reverent. The Sun King may be gone, but the light still lingers in the folds of this chamber. In the folds of that bed. Fringe tidbit. The royal upholsterer once claimed that the canopy fabric still held the heat of majesty. He was later promoted to Chief Chamber Poet, a title that came with both a feathered hat and 0 real duties. You feel something odd now, a twinge of nostalgia for a time you never lived. A quiet awe for a bed that managed to anchor generations of hierarchy with nothing more than a mattress and some velvet swagger. And it's not done yet, because someone always needs a place to stretch, to sigh, to declare, I'm still the centre of gravity, even if the world is spinning a little differently now. The rituals resume, slightly rebranded, but intact, because the bed, it was never about sleep. It was about spectacle, and like any good stage, it survives its leading actor. There's something quietly amusing about watching a new monarch try to fit into an old bed. Not physically, the sheets have been remade, the mattress refilled with fresh down, the sunburst embroidery updated to be slightly more flattering to the new profile, but the weight of it, that's harder to lie beneath. Mainstream fact, Louis XV, great-grandson of Louis XIV, inherited not just the throne but the entire palace infrastructure of ritual, spectacle, and etiquette, including the infamous ceremonial bed routine. While he maintained many customs, he was less enamoured with their theatricality and occasionally showed signs of rebellion in ways only a monarch could. You peer through the crack of a side door. The new king's lever is beginning. Sort of. The crowd is smaller. The room quieter. The bed the same. But where Louis XIV once woke with the precision of a sunrise and a perfectly placed sigh, Louis XV is groggy, muttering something about drafts and pulling the blanket halfway over his head. Someone coughs. A valet offers slippers. The king waves him away. Already the performance is off script. Fringe tidbit, Louis XV once refused to get out of bed for an entire morning, forcing his ministers to kneel beside the mattress to conduct official business while he yawned and chewed candied almonds. The court is clearly unsure how to respond. One duke tries to bow while backing out of the room only to trip over a rug corner and nearly take out a candle sconce. You wince. The bed doesn't. It just sits there, watching, judging, remembering. Historians still argue whether Louis XV's more casual approach marked the beginning of the end for Versailles' ceremonial culture. Some say he weakened it with indifference. Others argue he made it more human. Either way, the golden choreography now had a wrinkle. Fringe tidbit. An ambassador once remarked that the new king's lever had the scent of sleep and the tempo of indecision. He meant it kindly. It was not received that way. Still, the rituals go on. The shirt is offered. The robe is accepted grudgingly. The bed remains unruffled, though perhaps a little less smug than before. Because while it still matters, it's no longer the singular source of gravity. It's a stage being outgrown. You watch the nobles whisper later in the hallway. Did you see the way he kicked off the blanket? Did he really let his dog into the chamber? I heard he doesn't even like the canopy fabric. One countess fans herself as if faint from such casual treason. You suppress a smile, because the truth is, every ritual, no matter how grand, frays over time. And while the courtiers still gather, still practice their bows, still obsess over proximity to bedsheets, there's a sense that they're doing it more out of habit than reverence. Fringe Tidbit, a satirical pamphlet, began circulating during this time titled The Yawning Throne, which described the royal bed as a tired sponge of dreams and disillusion. The author was never discovered, but many suspected the royal tailor. You return to the chamber that evening. It's quieter still. The bed sits in its same place, fluffed, roped off, and faintly glowing with the effort of pretending nothing's changed. But you know better now, and so does it. The lever has lost some of its shine. The coucher feels less sacred. And for the first time, you wonder what happens to a bed that outlives its own mythology. You run your hand gently along the carved wood of the footboard. It's warm, worn, almost wistful, because a new king has risen. But the bed remembers the last one, and every monarch who dares lie beneath its canopy must contend not just with velvet and ceremony, but with the impossible ghost of grandeur. The bedchamber is still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from emptiness, but the kind that comes after too many years of movement. Rituals rise and fall, kings come and go, but the bed remains. Mainstream fact long after Louis XIV, the ceremonial bed continued to be part of Versailles' fabric through Louis XV's half-hearted performances, through Louis XV's distracted rituals, and even into the early whispers of revolution. The furniture outlived the monarchs it once propped up. You walk slowly across the room. The velvet ropes are gone. The slippers no longer wait at attention. The bed is no longer a stage, it's a memory. Or maybe a museum piece, depending on who you ask. Fringe Tidbit. During the French Revolution, when Versailles was stormed and the monarchy effectively dissolved, the royal bed was left untouched for days. A revolutionary reportedly sat on it and declared, "It's softer than justice, harder than liberty." You run your hand along the now dusty embroidery. The gold thread has dulled. The sun motifs are still there, but faded like someone tried to bleach out the monarchy with time. There are no nobles elbowing each other near the curtains, no whispering dukes, no fan choreography, just silence. Even the bed seems relieved. Historians still debate what finally broke the spell. Was it the exhaustion of centuries of bowing, the financial ruin, the Enlightenment's inconvenient questions about whether God really lived in a wig with a four-poster bed? Fringe Tidbit, a group of schoolchildren visiting Versailles in the 19th century, were asked to describe the royal bed. One called it a golden cage for sleepy birds. The teacher wept for reasons unknown. You sit on the stool once reserved for the third valet. The one who didn't speak. The one who just stood by in case the king sneezed. You sit there now, and nothing happens. No bells, no footmen, no audience. Just a memory unfolding like a sheet being turned down one last time. Because this isn't a throne anymore. It's a tomb of customs, a velvet fossil. And yet it still hums. You hear the echoes, the chuckles over chocolate, the stifled farts during prayer readings. The oaths whispered into pillow seams. It's all still here. The bed remembers. Fringe Tidbit, a later custodian of Versailles, claimed the bed groaned more on rainy days, not from age, he said, but from boredom. You rise. The bed stays still. No one fluffs it anymore. But it doesn't need fluffing. It has stories now. And in the end, it was never about the man who lay in it. It was about all the ones who stood around it watching, whispering, hoping. A court that revolved around sheets. A country that mistook stillness for strength. And a bed that, against all odds, outlived the sun, and now let everything in your mind begin to soften. The curtains fall closed. The golden carvings blur into shadow, and the long, winding corridors of Versailles dim into hushed velvet silence. You've wandered through ceremony, through candlelight and crushed brocade, through a palace where slippers held the weight of nations, and bedtime was the most political hour of the day. But that's all folding away now. The chamber doors close behind you, gentle as breath. Let go of the crowds, the bows, the whispered plans tucked behind feathered fans. Let go of the weight of wigs and the clamour of titles. Let your shoulders ease like a robe slipping to the floor. The royal bed stands quiet now, not to be observed, not to be guarded, not even to be performed upon. Just to be still. Let yourself be still, too. Like a page turned, like a pillow cooling in the night. You're no longer in the palace. You're beneath your own canopy now, where the velvet is sleep, where the throne is rest, where no one needs to perform anymore. Let the softness wrap around you. Let the echoes drift away. There are no slippers to polish here, no names to remember. Just your own breath, steady and slow. In and out. The lever is over. The lights are low. And the stage, it's yours now. But only for dreaming.